Lesson 2.2, Conditional Statements. Our job in this lesson is to understand how we put together logical arguments. So in the summer packet and in Lesson 1.3, we looked at conditional statements. A conditional statement has two parts, a hypothesis and a conclusion. Here's an example of a conditional statement. If I am too tired, then I will go to sleep. I want you to underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion. The hypothesis is what drives the whole statement. And here, the hypothesis is that I am tired. Notice that I did not underline the word if. If is not part of the hypothesis. It just clues you in that the hypothesis is about to come up next. The conclusion is the part that follows the word then. In this case, it's I will go to sleep. Again, notice that I did not circle the word then. That is not part of the conclusion. So typically we use letters as sentence variables because we don't want to always write that all out. So if I use P to represent my hypothesis and Q the conclusion, P would mean I am too tired, and Q would be that I will go to sleep. So if I want to write this sentence in shorthand, I would write it like this. P implies Q, or if P, then Q. So we can use these to draw some conclusions. We talked about this in the summer packet, and in fact, this is even on your mastery test, so hopefully this should be a bit of a review. But if we are given the statement, if the groundhog saw its shadow, then the weather will be bad, let's look at what happens in different scenarios. The first one says that the groundhog saw its shadow. Well, given our statement, this means that the weather will be bad. So what if the groundhog doesn't see its shadow? Well, here we've broken the hypothesis. Since we don't know anything about the hypothesis, we cannot draw any conclusion at all. If we know the hypothesis is true, then we know the conclusion is true. If we don't know the hypothesis is true, the conclusion might be true or it might be false. We just don't know. So what if we go backwards? If I know that the weather will be bad, there are different reasons that could cause this. One, the groundhog could have seen his shadow, but secondly, maybe it's just stormy. So in this case, again, we can draw no conclusion because there could be another cause to why the weather is bad. The last one is that the weather will be good. So if our hypothesis is true, then our conclusion must be true. Since our conclusion is not true, our hypothesis could not be true. Therefore, the groundhog did not see its shadow. So remember, if you know the hypothesis is true, then you know the conclusion is also true. If you know the conclusion is false, then you know the hypothesis had to also be false. The other scenarios, you really cannot draw a conclusion at all. So the next part talks about negation. Negation is kind of what it sounds like. It's making something negative. It's turning the truth value of it around. Informally, the negation of P would be the opposite of P. So if P is true, then the negation is false. If P is false, the negation would be true. We generally just say not P, and we use the little tilde in front of the P to indicate not. So let's look at our example above about our groundhog. The hypothesis was the groundhog saw its shadow. So the negation of that would be that the groundhog did not see its shadow. The conclusion in this case says that the weather will be bad. So the negation of this would be the opposite of bad weather. So we can say the weather will not be bad. We can say the weather will be good. We can even say it is not the case that the weather will be bad. In general, you want to use comfortable conversational English when you do this so that your sentences make sense. So here I'm just going to say that the weather isn't bad. Okay, so let's move on and try another one of these incomplete. So we're going to use the conditional. If it is raining, then it is pouring. We're going to symbolize P is the hypothesis and Q is the condition. Stop the video for a minute. I want you to try writing out the hypothesis and the conclusion, and then start the video again. Hopefully what you have for your hypothesis is something to the effect of, it is raining. And your conclusion should be that it is pouring. So when we go to symbolize this, we would say, if P, then Q. Make sure your P's and Q's look clear as to what letter is which. Now if we want to write the negation of these, this is our not P. We would want the opposite truth value of it is raining, so we can say that it is not raining. And for the conclusion, we would say that it is not pouring. In this way, we have made negations out of each of those sentences. It's important to note that if a statement is already negative, you can still negate it. A negative of a negative kind of makes it a positive. So if I say, I do not have any money, the negation of that would be that I do have money, or that I have some money. So let's move on and talk about converse, inverse, and contrapositive. This is one of the major concepts in this unit. So you're going to need to find a way to keep all of these straight, because they're all very similar, and you will be responsible for knowing how to get from one to the other. Each conditional statement of the form, if P then Q, has what we call related conditionals. My conditional here for this example, we're just going to tell you that you're given your hypothesis and conclusion. Usually what you're given is the conditional statement. Our symbolism is given to you here with if P then Q. Verbally, that's how we say that, if P then Q. Your converse switches your hypothesis and conclusion. You're going to flip these two. So instead of if P then Q, we have if Q then P. So we've just reversed our hypothesis and conclusion. Your inverse leaves the order alone, so P is still your hypothesis, Q is your conclusion, but it works with the negation of each of these. So we are going to not P and we are going to not Q. Okay? So if not P, then not Q. The final one is the contrapositive, and it's the really long word, and it does both. When I take my P and my Q, I'm going to switch them, and I'm going to negate them. So I would say if not Q, then not P. So let's do an example to make this make sense. We have the conditional, if it rains, then it pours. The converse switches those phrases, so now it says if it pours, then it rains. The inverse negates, if it does not rain, then it does not pour. And the contrapositive does both. If it does not pour, then it does not rain. Let's look at another one. If it burns, then it hurts. Converse switches. If it hurts, then it burns. Inverse negates. If it does not burn, then it does not hurt. Contrapositive does both. If it does not hurt, then it does not burn. All right, so this is a very typical way that we quiz you on this. We'll give you a conditional statement and have you fill out a chart along these lines. So we want you to write the statements, figure out the truth value, and if it's false, come up with a counterexample. Your truth value is always just true or false. Your counterexample we would only write if false, which should make sense because if it's true, there won't be a counterexample. Please don't leave it up to chance as to whether when you leave something blank, just draw a line through it if there's no reason to do a counterexample. So let's look at this one. If I live in Texas, then I live in the United States. Since all of Texas is in the United States, we're going to call this true. So there would be no counterexample, so I'm just going to put a line here to show that I don't need to do that. All right, your converse switches, if Q then P. So I'm going to take my hypothesis and my conclusion, and I'm going to flip them. So now this would read, if I live in the United States, then I live in Texas. Since this is not always true, we're going to have to call this one false. As far as a counterexample, your counterexample should be specific. We're not going to say something like, I could live somewhere else. We're going to choose one specific place to say this person is a counterexample. So I have a cousin who lives in New York, so I'm going to write, my cousin lives in New York. She proves that this is not true. New York is in the United States, so I've met the hypothesis, but it's not in Texas, so the conclusion fails. That proves this statement to be false. So let's go look at the inverse. Inverse keeps the same order, but negates. So instead of if I live in Texas, it will be if I do not live in Texas, then I do not live in the United States. This is very similar to the converse in that it is not true always. So we're going to call this one false as well. And for a while, my brother used to live in North Carolina. So my counterexample is going to be that my brother lives in North Carolina. Again, I've met the hypothesis. He doesn't live in Texas. He lives in North Carolina. But the conclusion fails. Since he does live in North Carolina, he does still live in the United States. So that proves this to be false. The last one is the contrapositive, and remember we're going to do both. We're going to negate and switch. So instead of if I live in Texas, then I live in the United States, then I'm going to negate and switch and come up with if I don't live in the United States, then I don't live in Texas. So in order to meet this hypothesis, I would have to live somewhere other than the United States. So I could live in France, I could live in Spain, I could live in Germany or Estonia or any sort of place. And if that happens, then it is also true that I do not live in Texas. That makes this true. There is no counterexample.